the characteristic of our perceptual experiences, given that naive realism is tied to a theory of the intentionality of perceptual experiences. Now, if that's the case, then we can explain some other puzzling features. In any perceptual situation, you have both an experience going on in your head and you have the real world out there. Now, here's the oddity of perceptual experience. The description of the inner experience in your head and the description of the real world out there is exactly the same description, same words in the same order. What did you see? Well, I saw a group of people in a narrow lecture room, and then I could spill in all the details. And now describe your inner experience. Well, I'm seeing a group of people in a narrow room, and I can then describe the various features. If I'm being extra cautious epistemically, I might say, well, it seemed to me exactly as if I were seeing a group of people in a real room. But this is the kind of thing that as philosophers we ought to be struck by this. The description of the inner experience going on in here uses exactly the same vocabulary, the same words in the same order as the description of the reality out there. How can that be? Well, the answer, I hope I know, is obvious, and that is what the inner experience gives you is the perceptual presentation, the intentional experience that has the presence of objects and states of affairs in the world as the conditions of satisfaction. So the description of the inner experience and the description of the real world, we use the same words in the same vocabulary because that's precisely what the inner experience does, is give you a direct presentation of objects and states of affairs in the world. And to the traditional epistemic charge, yeah, but how do you know it's not a hallucination? Well, of course, that's always a theoretical problem. But here is the point. Even in the case of a hallucination, I know what it's a hallucination of, right? I mean, if it should turn out this whole experience was a hallucination, I didn't give this talk, but I had a hell of a hallucination, and it sure was like giving a talk, I know exactly what the conditions of satisfaction are. That is to say, the conditions of satisfaction are internal to the character of the experience. Okay, but now let's look at some more, some other contemporary views. I got into this, working on this, because I hadn't worked on this for a long time. There's a chapter in Intentionality about it, but I haven't really worked on this. But there is a view around, I hope it hasn't penetrated Prague, it's called disjunctivism. And it turns out my home university is sort of a world capital of disjunctivism. So in a couple of minutes I'll tell you a little bit about it. Disjunctivism, it's an ugly word, but here's why they call it that. Disjunctivism says, in the case of the hallucination and the case of the veridical experience, they have nothing in common other than the fact that they're indistinguishable. So the experience is supposed to be disjoint. It's either or. Either you're seeing the real world or you're having a hallucination, but there's nothing in common between the two. And then they can see, but of course they're indistinguishable. Well, the problem with that is it looks like you've just contradicted yourself, because indistinguishable implies there's some respect in which they are indistinguishable, and that is to say they have, in my jargon, they have the same conditions of satisfaction. Now, how would anybody get into this disjunctivism? How would anybody get into that? And I think the answer is they accept what I said was the worst argument in the past 400 years of Western philosophy. It's just that they want to reject one of the premises. The argument goes, if the perception and the hallucination have their features in common, then any analysis of the perception must apply, any analysis of hallucination must apply to the perception. You have to give the same analysis of both. And since in the case of the hallucination, you're not actually seeing objects, so you have to say in the case of the perception, you're not actually seeing objects. Now what they want to do is accept the formal validity of that argument and challenge the first premise, the premise that says, well, in the case of the perception and the hallucination, they have something in common. They want to deny that and say, no, they don't really have anything in common. It's this disjunctive character. And then they say rather mysterious things, like they say, well, the object itself is part of the perception in the case of the veridical experience. And we've seen a sense in which that is true because of the presentational character of the intentionality. Then the whole experience involves a relationship between you and an actual object. Okay, but notice now the way that I've described it, where the disjunctivist says there's nothing in common between the veridical case and the hallucination, even though they are indistinguishable. It seems to me there are two problems that the disjunctivist really can't cope with. And that is to say, the problem of how come then it seems to us in the hallucination case, it seems to us that we're actually seeing objects and states of affairs in the world, and they reject the intentionality of the visual experience, so they can't account for that. But furthermore, it seems to me, and this is worse, it makes a neurobiology of vision impossible, because the neurobiology of vision, the current research in vision science, which by the way is flourishing, there's all kinds of things going on in vision science. We know a lot more than we knew 20 years ago. That's based on the assumption that the character of the visual experience is entirely fixed by what happens after the photons hit the retina. That is to say, you can duplicate the visual experience simply by duplicating the same neuronal processes in the brain. You can subtract the real world. Now, of course, in real life, you don't subtract the real world. That's the whole point of visual experience, is to give us a perceptual access to the real world. But it seems to me that disjunctivists can't really deal with the fact that when we're actually experience things, we have to make a distinction between the character of the experience that we're having and the world that the experience gives us a presentation of, even though, as I said earlier, the same description applies to both, the same words in the same order. Now, one of my favorite disjunctivists is my colleague, Mike Martin, and I'm going to quote a passage from his. He says, such experiences either can have only experience-dependent objects, talk about hallucinations now, or not be in relation to objects at all. If you assume that there's a common kind between perceptual experiences and hallucinations, between the veridical and the illusory, by the common kind assumption, whatever is true of the kind of experience that one has when one is hallucinating, the same must be true of the kind of experience one has when one is perceiving. Now, I want to say both this account and the tradition have a mistaken conception of intentionality. In fact, about 300 years of mistaken philosophy is contained in that passage. That I like Mike Martin. He's a great philosopher. It's just that, like great philosophy, makes a lot of horrendous mistakes. And this particular passage, I think, embodies that. That is to say, you cannot assume. His assumption is that, look, whatever is true of the experience that one has when one is hallucinating, the same must be true of the veridical experience. There's a sense in which that is right. They both have the same condition of satisfaction. But there's a sense in which it's wrong. Namely, in one case, the conditions of satisfaction are satisfied. And in the other case, the conditions of satisfaction are not satisfied. So this mistake that I said had a grammatical basis, confusing the intentional sense of aware of, perceived, is conscious of, with the constitutive sense, that goes on to this day. And this passage that I quoted to you is an example of that confusion. So, as usual in philosophy, if we mind our P's and Q's, if you get the details right at the beginning, then it seems to me a lot of the mistakes can be avoided. The correct account is this: perceptual experiences are conscious events occurring in the brain. It's characteristic of the perceptual experience that it gives you direct presentational access to the real world itself, and that